Women of Aboriginal descent are 3.5 times more likely to experience violence than any other race in all of the Americas. And nowhere is that statistic more horrifyingly true than on Canada's Highway 16, Yellowhead Highway, or as you might know it, the Highway of Tears, the place that swallows First Nation women like no other place on earth. For decades, the rumors spread, the bodies piled up, and the missing persons reports lay gathering dust. But it wasn't until 2013 that police finally admitted that this specific highway was a black hole where women went missing at an unprecedented rate. No amount of sugarcoating could hide the truth anymore. Canada has a killer problem, and most importantly, those killers are targeting one demographic more than any other. So let's talk about this highway first before we get to the missing women on it. Because the victims, let me just say that this list is an enormous one. Its official name is Yellowhead Highway, a 450-mile stretch of Highway 16 in British Columbia, Canada. That's 724 kilometers for our friends outside of the U.S. In our Highway Serial Killers series, we've briefly touched on the Highway of Tears, pointing out specific clusters, killers, and events, but this time, we're looking at the highway as a whole. Yes, there are enormous amounts of serial killing cases on this highway, but that's not the only thing that's happening here. This entire roadway is a systemic land of forgotten people that are targeted in a number of vicious and despicable ways. The serial killers are just a drop in the overall bucket of horrendous neglect. So according to the confirmed numbers, there have been more than 80 women who've gone missing or who have been killed on that 450-mile stretch since 1969. Half of those women were of Indigenous descent, but the First Nations people claim that number is closer to 800, maybe even more. And this is no coincidence. The fact is that there are many little towns and settlements along the highway, around 23 of them, totaling around 20,000 people that hail from the First Nations. The men, for the most part, work in the logging, tourism, forestry, and fisheries industries, where the companies normally arrange transport to work sites. The women, on the other hand, have no means of transport to the nearest towns or locations where they need to work. Since there are virtually no public transport options available to them, they do the only thing they can do. They hitchhike to and from work. Make no mistakes, these are not girls and women putting themselves into dangerous situations voluntarily. They quite literally have no other choice but to hitchhike so that they can feed their families. Law enforcement hasn't been all that concerned with the welfare of these small groups scattered around nearly 500 miles, so the people are left to fend for themselves. Naturally, opportunistic killers seek out these vulnerable communities, and violent crime is mostly ignored by authorities. If a call comes in about a missing teenager, it's easier to write it off as a runaway than to drive out to the middle of the wilderness to go look for them. Even when entire families are targeted in multiple violent events, still, the police aren't investigating cases of arson, stabbings, kidnappings, or sexual assaults. The First Nations community have been struggling to get recognition for this horrendous lack of protection since the early 70s. Seriously, they have done everything they possibly can to get the help they need. Memorials, protests, and awareness campaigns of the systemic neglect and underfunding of Indigenous infrastructure. Red dresses line the highway, one for every missing or murdered woman, like crosses next to the road where people have perished in car accidents. So too do the red dresses remind everyone who passes by that the highway preys on women. When authorities finally admitted to the reality of the situation in 2013, it took another 4 years before any public transport options were made available. And I'm not going to mince words here. It was a half-arsed job. Half of these communities are still without transport, and what little there is available is rarely maintained properly. Look, I'm not going to get into politics and systemic abuse of minority groups. This is not the channel for that. But I will make one thing clear. The women we're about to talk about would all still have been here if they were just given the basic means of transport that everyone else in the country gets. Yet, they were not deemed important enough to spend public tax dollars on. Just an extra patrol car, an officer that's not 50 miles away from a call, or even just opening a file when someone is attacked. The bare minimum would have saved hundreds of lives, yet, still, the Highway of Tears looms over Canada like a black hole, waiting to suck in another victim. This highway is so notorious simply because one racial group has been neglected far more than any other in Canada for far too long that no one can deny anymore. The first murder that really got some national recognition was that of Ramona Lisa Wilson, who was found dead in June of 1994. The family and the MMIW organization, which stands for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, protested with marches to seek justice for the 16-year-old victim. The Ramona Lisa Wilson Memorial Walk is still held every year to this very day. In many ways, Ramona is the reason that we even know about the Highway of Tears at all. Sadly, the recognition that Ramona's death brought was already decades too late to save the many others that came before her. So let's start with the 1970s, where the data begins. Take a breath. This is a rough one. I try to give every single woman and girl a name where I can. Just because the police forgot about them doesn't mean we have to. I want to give as many of them their identities, their humanity, and worth back in the only way I know how, to show you their smiles and tell you their names. They were loved, they are still loved, and we will give them as much dignity as we possibly can. First came Tracy Clifton, who disappeared after walking out of her home in October of 1970. Police never filed a report despite her parents' insistence that she hadn't run away, nor did they take any photographs or even basic information about her age or height. To this day, there is still no report for Tracy, and all that we know is that she was First Nations, that she lived in Prince Rupert, and that she was a teenager. Get used to that vague narrative. You're about to hear a lot of it. No reports filed, no concern, and no department willing to investigate anything. The same month, Helen Care Frost went missing after walking out of the apartment she shared with her sister in Queensway, Prince George. The 17-year-old was labeled as a runaway almost immediately simply because she'd given birth 6 months before her disappearance. An unwed mother in 1970 was automatically considered a bad seed, so Helen's family were the only people who set out to search for her. Police never once sent out a search party. The family discovered that Helen had been seen hitching a ride from a truck driver, possibly to get to one of the 3 jobs that she was holding down. Helen was no slouch. She worked hard. Her employers reported that she was very reliable, and she left all her belongings, clothes, and money behind. But the fact that she'd had a baby at 17 was enough to shove her file in the back of the cabinet along with the rest. A few days after Helen, 18-year-old Jean Virginia Sampare vanished from a bridge. The shy factory worker was walking with her cousin near the railroad overpass on Highway 16 outside of Gitse-Gukla. He turned back to get a jacket, but when he returned 15 minutes later, Jean was gone. There's an odd series of events with Jean's disappearance, though. Just days before she disappeared, her boyfriend had gone missing too. His body was found drowned in a nearby river a few days after Jean went missing. His case was classified as a homicide, though still unsolved. But Jean's case was written off as a suicide or runaway out of grief after her boyfriend left her, despite the fact that Jean had never in her life done anything dangerous or outrageous before. If anything, she was rather timid and weary of strangers. In December, 14-year-old Monica Ignas was walking home in a snowstorm near midnight, because as we know, there's no transport systems available in Thornhill. Her body was found months later, strangled and dumped in a ditch. 2 men witnessed Monica get into a car. They saw the man driving the vehicle too, yet there are no records that any inquiries or sketches were made, and virtually no investigation took place. 1971, Coreen Thomas, 21 years old and 9 months pregnant, was run over by a drunk driver, Richard Reddycop. Both Coreen and her baby died. You might think this one got solved and it was just a simple hit and run, but quite the contrary. It was later proven that 2 young boys were coerced by police to give false statements that Coreen was intoxicated, which she most certainly was not. To make matters worse, Reddycop had run over an Indigenous man 10 years earlier, killing him. He was let off on those charges and given a lesser charge for Coreen's death too. 2 years before Coreen died, her cousin was also hit by a car that belonged to Reddycop, but was driven by Redekop's brother on the very same road in the Verderhoof settlement where Coreen was killed, just yards away from each other. Are you seeing where the injustices are coming from now? 3 First Nations people, all from the same town. 2 related to one, another to one another, and all killed on the same road by a pair of brothers. Yet those bastards were let out scot-free, and by the looks of things, the police helped them. Coreen, her cousin, and the unnamed Indigenous man's deaths is what lit up the warning signs for the First Nations people in earnest. Despite the community's lawsuits and inquiries, barely anything was done about the fact that 3 community members died under highly suspicious circumstances and that the police were seemingly aiding the killers. In '78, 31-year-old Mary Jane Hill was found in the snow, nude 31 miles from Prince Rupert. The coroner's report read that she died of bronchitis and bronchopneumonia as a result of manslaughter. Now, I'm sorry, but that explanation doesn't fly with me at all. Bronchitis is an illness that builds in severity over time, yet Mary was in perfect health the day before her body was found. Her police report is only 1 page long, and the semen sample found on her body has never been tested. She was buried in an unmarked grave, and it took her daughter, Vicky, who was only 6 months old at the time of her mother's death, years to locate Mary's grave because police never filed the location of her grave. A suspected serial killer operated between 1969 and 1983. Gloria Moody, Monica Jack, and Colleen McMillan were all walking alone when they disappeared along that highway. Years later, DNA extracted from Colleen McMillan's body traced back to the American serial killer Bobby Jack Fowler. Fowler is suspected of 16 other murders across the U.S. These 3 murders, however, occurred while he was employed briefly by a roofing company in Prince George. Since they match his MO and the fact that they occurred while he was in the area, it makes it almost certain that Gloria, Monica, and Colleen were victims of Fowler. Shortly after Fowler went back to the U.S., another serial killer picked up where he'd left off. Between 81 and 82, Joseph Edward Dennis Isaac murdered Jean Mary Kovacs, Rothwither Fuchsbickler, and Nina Marie Joseph, also around the Prince George area. You'd think that a serial killer being caught would be huge news, especially after one had just skipped town, but no, there are no photographs of the victims or their killer, even though he was sentenced to life in prison for these 3 deaths. All we know is that he targeted Indigenous girls specifically and that he was caught. But other than that, it looks like authorities have done everything they could to bury the details of this killer and his victims. In 1984, an entire family went missing. Ronald and Doreen Jack took their 2 sons, aged 4 and 9, from Prince George under the pretense that Ronald was being offered a job at a logging company. The man who offered Ronald the job was seen by several people, as was his pickup truck. Still, no one's been arrested, and the family were never seen again. The Jack family disappearance is a very strange one, and it really should have a video all on its own, to be honest with you. But for now, let's continue on with more murders that police ignored. In '89, 24-year-old Alberta Gail Williams' naked body was found east of Prince Rupert near the Thai overpass. Her bloody clothes were found miles away, but they were never collected as evidence. Instead, police destroyed it before her body was found. Why they do such a thing is inconceivable to me. Saying that law enforcement is making me boil with anger would be an understatement, but their negligence and seemingly zero care for the piles of dead bodies is just going to keep getting worse, so hold on to your boots. That same year, 15-year-old Cecilia Ann Nickel disappeared. A year before that, her cousin, Delphine Nickel, vanished too, and 2 years later, another cousin, Roberta Cecilia Nickel, was murdered. Cecilia and Delphine were written off as runaways. Roberta's case was never solved. So in the space of 3 years, 3 girls from the same family are killed, and police refuse to confirm a pattern? Another serial killer was caught and later charged with 2 more deaths around Prince George in 1990. A man named Brian Peter Arp was definitively linked by DNA to the murders of Marnie Blanchard and Therese Humphrey, but good luck finding his details, pictures, or even photographs of his victims. Just like before, Murderers have a habit of disappearing into the ether on Yellowhead. In February of 1990, the fire department was called to put out a fire that started in the Brooks Bank building, an apartment complex that housed almost only First Nations people. This was the third time in 1 year that a fire was started with the intention of burning the place and everyone in it down. This time, the arsonists got their wish. Helga, Sherry, Pauline Rochon, as well as baby Kimberly, who was under a year old, all died in the blaze. Many don't put the Rochon massacre in the highway of tears, but I do. This was undoubtedly a targeted attack and another case where no photos, articles, or any trace of a file can be found. Another example of the indigenous people of the area having multiple events that was so concerning that police should have been on high alert, yet they barely investigated the 2 attempted arsons on that building in the months leading up to the final blaze. Just another case of the complete and utter lack of support for the indigenous peoples along this highway. Later that year, an underage sex worker, Roxanne Thera, was killed after going out to meet a customer. Just months later, her best friend, Alicia Germain, was stabbed to death right outside her school. Both girls were just 15 years old, and there's been no movement in the case at all. Roxanne and Alicia's deaths were suspected to be related to the Nickel Cousins murders because all the girls were teenagers and were from the Prince George and Smithers areas. I don't agree with that assessment. I believe that the Nickel Cousins were targeted by one individual, while Alicia and Roxanne were targeted by someone else. But all that means is that we now probably have 2 separate serial killers added to an already alarmingly long list. Next, we have another possible serial cluster of 4 women that went missing under similar circumstances. In 1995, Lana Derrick hitched a ride with 2 men in Thornhill and was never seen again. Just like Monica McKay, who went out with friends in 1999, only to vanish off the face of the earth. The third to go missing was Nicole Hoare, 22 years old, in 2002 after getting into a bright orange car on Gauthier Road west of Prince George. Witnesses saw the car and the Caucasian man driving it, but no one's ever been identified and Nicole's still missing. The fourth victim in this grouping is 22-year-old Tamara Lynn Chipman, who disappeared somewhere between Prince Rupert and Terrace. There were 3 separate searches conducted for her. Tamara's case is still unsolved and ice cold, but at least she was given the resources that she deserved, thanks mostly to the never-ending outcry from the First Nations people who continuously demanded more attention for their missing girls. There were 3 more deaths starting in 2004 that many believe are related to Tamara, Nicole, Lana, and Monica's cluster. And those are Melanie Dawn Brown, who was shot to death, and Mary Madeline George, who went missing after she had to walk to a clinic for miles. Both came from Prince George, and both cases are as cold as the Canadian winter. Neither woman had a search party sent out for them when the families reported them missing, and both women were out walking because there was no transport available to them. The third potential victim of this cluster was Aaliyah Catherine Sarek Auger, just 14. Aaliyah thumbed a ride and was never seen again. Again, there's the question of whether or not this is all one killer or if 2 or more killers with similar MOs were operating at the same time. It's happened before, so I wouldn't be surprised. But that does narrow the suspects down to long-haul truckers, delivery drivers, and people who need to travel between Prince Rupert, Smithers, and Prince George on a regular basis. Besides the potential serial cases, here are some other cases that didn't get the time they deserved or were shoved under the rug. 39-year-old Ada Elaine Brown was found in a hotel room with a blow to her head that was so severe that it shattered her skull, even though no item or sharp corner in the room indicated that she'd slipped and fallen on it. Police still wrote it off as an alcohol-related accident and never looked at the case again. Then Blair Evan Donnelly stabbed his teenage daughter, Stephanie, to death. He was let out less than 2 years later, only to stab a friend. Then he attacked a patient at the hospital he was being held at a few days later. He was let out again and went on to stab 3 more people on a crowded street in Chinatown before being locked up for good. Donnelly's family called for help dozens of times before Stephanie was killed. but the only time police ever bothered to show up was to collect a 16-year-old's body. Bonnie Marie Joseph and Beverly Warbrick both went missing in 2007, also because they had no means of transport at their disposal. In 2007, 21-year-old Cody Allen Legebikoff was convicted of 4 murders. It was proven that he'd murdered Cynthia Frances Moss, Natasha Lynn Montgomery, Jill Stacy Stukenko, and 15-year-old Lauren Dawn Leslie. A year later, Emily Rose McLean was found drowned in the Prince Rupert Harbor after spending the night with people that were known to be violent. People have labeled the 16-year-old's death as an accident one, despite all evidence pointing toward foul play. Next came Madison Geraldine Scott, who was abducted from a campsite. For 2 days, no one was sent out to check up on her, even though her parents had called police with their concerns that their daughter was not answering her phone. In the end, it was her parents who went out there, only to find her tent open, her sleeping bag pushed aside, and Maddie missing. 10 years later, her remains were found 12 miles away in some bushes. No suspects, obviously no proper searches, or else they would have found her body a decade ago. And no explanation as to how a woman vanished from a camping spot that had several people in attendance when she disappeared. In 2013, Garrett Stephen George killed Destiny Ray Tom. Stephen had been arrested multiple times for extremely violent crimes in Prince George and Burns Lake. Despite his long history of violence and the fact that he literally beat Destiny to death in a fit of rage, Stephen only got 11 years for manslaughter. It's almost like the justice system is intentionally releasing the most violent criminals onto the highway at this point. Immaculate Bazille, or Mackie as everyone called her, disappeared that year too. Again, the 2 suspects that were last seen with her were not arrested. The 2 men were seen on the road where Mackie was last sighted, dripping wet like they'd been in the nearby river. Their cars and homes were not searched. Anita Florence Thorne was abducted from her car in Prince George. The same happened to Chantel Catherine Simpson over in Terrace. Abandoned car, missing woman, no clues, and barely any word from police or seemingly any effort to get information out to the public. It's around here, in 2018, that we see a serious shift in how police approach missing women. Now, I need to make a point here before we move on. I only mentioned a handful of cases where police did an especially terrible job when the attacks were targeted or multiple attempts on someone's home was made and when authorities blatantly ignored warning signs and calls for help. There are hundreds more cases of girls and women dying and disappearing on this highway between 1970 and 2018. And I cannot possibly name them all, but you get the idea. Yellowhead Highway has been overlooked and forgotten about for decades, and it's thanks to the constant marches, pleas, posters, and vigils that the Canadian government is legally required to send out search parties, helicopters, officers, and search dogs. Now, most of the cases are being thoroughly investigated, and a surprising amount of them are being solved within the same year that they transpire. It's not all sunshine and daisies, though. There's still a massive lack of public transport for the citizens, and the few bus routes that have been set up are still a few miles away from communities. So women are still walking for long stretches to get to those stops, and there have been a handful of very odd deaths that have occurred since the minimal changes have been made. Cynthia Martin disappeared from her car and no investigation took place. A woman named Cassandra Kale was found deceased in the backseat of a car that was pulled over during a traffic stop in 2020. Her death was ruled a homicide, but for some reason, neither of the 2 people who were inside the car at the time of the discovery were arrested or named as suspects, and there's no record of them being investigated at all. Christine Marion West, who repeatedly asked for help from police because she was being stalked, stopped answering her phone. When her family reported her as missing, police never checked up on her. Her relatives found her a few days later deceased inside her apartment, killed by the man that was stalking her. So again, we see a case of repeated pleas for help being ignored, only to result in the victim's eventual death because of authoritative negligence. The Highway of Tears stands as a threaded link between fractured communities who were not so long ago targeted by their own government, to abolish their traditions and culture through brutal residential schools and the forceful separation of families. And now, this spiderweb system, where dirt back roads and major trucking routes collide, all spread over these impoverished, unprotected last remnants of the native peoples of the North, has become a hunting ground for a new generation of predators who seek those that are the most vulnerable. As of now, there are more than 80 unsolved cases of missing or murdered girls and women along Yellowhead Highway. That's just what's officially on the books. If the First Nations calculations are correct, and I believe that they are, there are hundreds more. For a community of less than 20,000 people, to have half of those cases be Indigenous women, well, you don't need to be a genius to see that there's a targeted problem here. It's been happening for nearly a century, and it's still happening today. The Highway of Tears is still weeping for its lost sisters, all of them. We're now 5 videos into this series of highway murders, and we're not even close to the home stretch yet. Personally, I think the heydays of the serial killers of the 70s and 80s haven't disappeared at all, like many want to kid themselves into believing. There are still many of them out there, but most of them are using the busy industrial roads to hide their crimes. Maybe I'm wrong. I hope I am. Or maybe you have some thoughts. Do you think there are still killers trucking around the country today, but they just got smarter? Do you think Canada's Yellowhead Highway is still being targeted and forgotten intentionally? Or is our world just full of monsters, period? You know what to do. Let me know in the comments below. And while you're at it, don't forget to leave a like and to subscribe. And take a second to think about the women and girls before you go to bed tonight. They've been forgotten about for long enough. It's time to remember them.